Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Blessings of Civilization, the Roots of American Imperialism, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the National Humanities Center and the Teaching American History Project of Osceola County Schools. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. And before we get underway, I want to welcome back all of our friends in Osceola County. I hope you folks had a good summer, and I hope the school year has gotten off to a good start for you. And just let me remind you of a few things. We have, in addition to the seminars we're running for the Teaching American History Project, we have a really good fall lineup of online professional development seminars. They range in topics from, slavery in the Atlantic world, slave narratives. We're looking at the life of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, consumer politics in the American Revolution, deism. We're looking at some literary topics this year, teaching Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, Flannery O'Connor, Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time. So check with our online seminars and tell your English teacher colleagues that we're offering programming for them as well. You can get to our seminar schedule by going to americainclass.org. It'll put you on this landing page, and from there you can gain access to all of the resources and programs the National Humanities Center runs for teachers. Let me remind you that, as always, a recording and the PowerPoint presentation for this evening's seminar will be available after the seminar. You'll find them on the Blessings of Civilization website, the site from which you obtained your readings for the seminar. We invite you to plunder the PowerPoint, use it in your classes. We also remind you, please, to complete the evaluation you will find on the Blessings of Civilization website. Send that back to us. It's very important to us, and it's also very important to the Teaching American History program. As always, too, we will send you documentation of participation in the seminar so that you'll be able to present that to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit this seminar warrants. We'll do that once we have your evaluation form in our hands. Now, we have two simple goals for this evening. First, we want to deepen your understanding of American nation building and empire building in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then we want to provide you with some fresh primary resources and instructional approaches for use with your students. We had a pretty good discussion of this topic on the forum. You presented us with some really interesting questions. Let's just take a look at them. What were some of the underlying causes of overseas U.S. colonialism during and after 1898? What were Americans' main arguments for and against the occupation of overseas territories? How were these arguments shaped by U.S. racial politics? On what grounds did Filipino leaders oppose U.S. conquest of the Philippines? How did American imperialism affect smaller, weaker countries? To what extent, if at all, was the American imperialism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries an extension of manifest destiny? There were some others as well. What role did religion play in America's colonizing efforts? How well did the phrase white man's burden resonate with the American public? How widespread was its use? How did average American feel about our involvement abroad, especially given the nation's long history of avoiding foreign entanglements? How did the colonized view America's colonizing efforts? Did American imperialism differ from that practiced by other imperial powers? Were we more enlightened or philanthropic? What role did social Darwinism play in our foreign policies? And finally, how, if at all, did our imperialistic policies benefit us? How, if at all, did they benefit our colonial subjects? Lots of interesting questions, ladies and gentlemen. And to help us thread our way through these, we are very pleased to have with us this evening Paul Kramer, an associate professor of history at Vanderbilt University. Paul's research interests include modern U.S. transnational, imperial, and global histories. He is the author, in 2006, of an award-winning book, The Blood of Government, Race, Empire, and the United States in the Philippines. So, Paul, let me turn the program over to you, make you the presenter here. And so now, Paul, it's all yours. Tell us about American imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. All yours.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Richard. It's great to be with you all. Yeah, I guess I'd just like to start by giving a brief overview of what we're talking about when we talk about U.S. colonialism at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century. and then talk a little bit about some of the main interpretations that historians have used to make sense of this development in U.S. history. And then we'll move along to some primary documents and explore the subject by looking at some of the historical voices representing different perspectives on 1898 and U.S. colonialism. So first, what are we talking about? In 1898, the U.S. Becomes involved militarily in the Caribbean and in East Asia in unprecedented ways. The U.S. becomes a colonial power, meaning that it exercises formal state authority over non-contiguous parts of the world. And it becomes a colonial power that's a history that will, in many ways, continue into the present. That while some of those colonies become formally independent after World War II, Puerto Rico, for example, remains a U.S. colony, even though it goes by the name, by other names like having Commonwealth status, et cetera. But in other words, to understand some of those ongoing relationships down to the 20th century, we really have to understand the origin point in the early 20th century with the beginning of U.S. colonialism. That history begins with the U.S. Expanding as an industrial power, beginning to increase its economic output, not yet emerging as a military power or as a diplomatic power in the late 19th century, but suddenly feeling the need to have greater influence abroad in order to extend the range of U.S. exports in particular. As it's doing that, it's facing out onto a crisis of somebody else's colonialism, specifically of Spanish colonialism, that both in the Caribbean and in East Asia, Spain, which of course had been one of the founding empires that integrated the Atlantic world beginning in the 15th century, right, with Columbus's travels and eventually Spanish colonization of Central and South America. Spain had emerged initially as one of the world's great powers, but by the 19th century, it's facing a whole series of crises, crises involving independence movements in Latin America that are beginning to shake its authority in the early 19th century and about the late 19th century. Just as the U.S. is becoming a rising power, Spain is really collapsing as an imperial power and is really left with only having a handful of its former colonies, namely Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Western Hemisphere, and the Philippines and a few other islands in the Pacific and in East Asia. In both cases, its authority is being challenged by independence movements. And so in Cuba, you begin to have independence movements breaking out in the 1860s and really continuously sort of there's a wave after wave of independence struggle among white Cubans, but especially among slaves and newly emancipated slaves in Cuba that are weakening Spanish authority into the 1890s when a third and final revolution really gets Cuba to the brink of independence, coming into 1895 and 1896. Meanwhile, the Philippines, you know, an old Spanish colony that's mostly been run by Spanish clerics, is also facing independence movement led by local elites, fed by popular discontent with Spanish rule that also breaks out in 1896. And so coming into the late 19th century, you have a situation where the U.S. has an increasing need for a greater military and economic presence abroad in order to try to project U.S. goods. You have independence movements clamoring for independence in the context of a weakening Spanish colonialism. And that really sets the stage for U.S. entry into the Caribbean and East Asia. Richard, should I continue or?
Well, let's move on through the slides.
Sure.
If those constitute your introductory remarks, shall we move ahead then?
Okay, sure. Let's see. It's the right arrow that I'm going to click? Sorry.
The right arrow, that moves you ahead. That's right.
Okay. I'm not getting, it's not moving me. Let's see.
See, so it's the arrow up there at the box that says 09.
Yeah, got it.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, so just let me give you a little more context. So what happens in 1898 itself? So you have this setup in which you have sort of rising U.S. economic power, weakening Spanish colonialism, what really sets off the events of 1898 are a variety of very contingent events. Basically, what you have is the American public having become much more aware of events in Cuba, particularly, where the Spanish are putting down the Cuban rebellion with brutal force, using a new technique that comes to be known as the concentration camp, where they basically incarcerate huge populations in these fenced compounds where there's mass starvation and disease. The American public is outraged by this sense that literally, a few miles off of American shores, you have these human rights atrocities that are happening. So that becomes one important context for raising Americans' attention to what's happening in the Spanish Empire. The other important event is that the U.S. government begins to move to try to protect U.S. commercial interests in Cuba. There's a lot of U.S. sugar investments. There are a fair number of Americans living in Cuba that are very concerned about their livelihood and their safety in the context of this revolution. And so it's in that context the United States sends the USS Maine to Havana Harbor, where famously, under mysterious auspices, it explodes toward the beginning of 1898. Suddenly this becomes a very different kind of issue in which politicians that are interested in trying to intervene in Cuba are now able to tap into popular outrage and to some extent to create popular outrage around the sense that the Spanish have blown up this vessel. This is a violation of American honor, and the U.S. now has to intervene in order to both secure Cuban freedom and to restore American honor. It's in that context that the U.S. Congress declares war on Spain in April 1898, and the first act of the U.S. military is to send the Pacific Squadron to Manila Bay to fight against the Spanish Navy there. And one could ask, this is a campaign happening in Cuba, what does it have to do with the Philippines? But it's very much on the minds of policymakers that they're now at war with a global empire that has a colony not only in Cuba, but also in the Philippines. And given that there was a growing interest among American exporters in the possibility that if you had a military base somewhere in Asia, it would help you get American goods into the markets of China, that were really imagined to be this bottomless opportunity for American exporters. And so the Navy sends the Pacific Squadron under Commodore Dewey to fight the Spanish. And on May 1st, 1898, the U.S. Navy defeats the Spanish Navy in the Battle of Manila Bay. Over the summer, U.S. forces deploy into the Caribbean in order to join the Cuban revolutionary struggle on the ground and to try to defeat the Spanish. And I won't go into the military details, but basically, as a result of the weakening of Spanish authority by Cuban insurgents, the United States is able to defeat the Spanish by August of 1898, both through land battles and also through some decisive naval battles in the Philippines, in Cuba. Meanwhile, what's happening in the Philippines is that Commodore Dewey has brought back from Singapore Emilio Aguinaldo, from Hong Kong, Emilio Aguinaldo, who is the leader of a Filipino revolution that has gone into exile after having been defeated. And Dewey's interest is in trying to use Aguinaldo and his revolution in order to help hold American options open for the Philippines, but without actually declaring U.S. support. And so he returns Aguinaldo to the islands. Aguinaldo, at the same moment that the U.S. is mobilizing to deploy its forces in Cuba, Aguinaldo reconnects with revolutionaries on the ground in the Philippines and defeats the Spanish throughout much of the Philippine archipelago. He declares an independent republic, actually initially a dictatorship under his authority, in June of 1898. By the end of the year, it will begin to evolve into an elite-led republic, the first self-declared republic in Asia. And so in August of 1898, what's happening in the Philippines is that you have an independent government under Filipino leadership But meanwhile, the United States doesn't acknowledge that government. It negotiates a treaty, initially negotiates a peace settlement with Spain in August of 1898, and lands its forces in Manila. It takes control of Manila from the Spanish without allowing the Filipino Revolution to enter the city. So coming into the fall of 1890, you have a very odd situation. You have U.S. military forces occupying both Cuba and the capital of the Philippines, Manila, on opposite sides of the earth. So this is really about the global projection of military power for the first time. Going into the peace settlement after the war, the United States and Spain negotiate this treaty without consulting Cubans, without consulting Filipinos. They basically treat this as a war in which the inhabitants of these territories were only incidentally involved. Initially, McKinley is not really sure what the disposition of the Philippines should be. He's under pressure coming from competing sides. There's a new anti-imperialist movement that's very wary about the United States taking control of colonies and territories. You also have, robust imperialism. Advocates who call for the possession of U.S. territories as a way of extending U.S. power and are joining the club of big imperial powers. Eventually, McKinley will conclude and will instruct his negotiators to push for possession of the entire Philippine archipelago. But in the meantime, policymakers have been, in Congress, have passed what comes to be known as the Teller Amendment, which basically declares that the U.S. has no intentions to have a long-term permanent occupation of Cuba. This will later get abrogated, it will later get qualified, but what the negotiators with the Spanish at the end of the war are pushing for is a temporary occupation of Cuba under the U.S. military, and in a sense, an occupation of undetermined duration for the Philippines. What happens in the spring of 1899 is that the Senate confirms the Treaty of Paris with Spain by one vote. It's a very narrow and contested vote in Congress. Meanwhile, Filipino revolutionaries become aware that despite American promises that they're there to liberate Filipinos from Spain, that the United States is pushing to pursue colonialism of its own in the Philippines. Tensions break out on the ground. American soldiers fire on some Filipino sentries, and you have a war in the Philippines beginning in February of 1899. And so that's really where, setting the stage for the debate that we're going to focus on in this class. We have a context in which the U.S. is now fighting to secure a new colony in the Philippines. It has military forces occupying Cuba and Puerto Rico, and there's a raging debate in American politics and civil society about what this means for American society and for the world, and whether this is a legitimate undertaking to participate in. So that's by means of setting the stage. Now, just to kind of look at some of the main interpretations about the causes of this set of developments in U.S. history. This is a set of events that have long been discussed and debated by historians. For the long time, the main explanations really emphasized what can be called the aberration thesis. That was the notion that basically 1898 and the U.S. acquisition of colonies were kind of a fluke in U.S. history, that were the result of a whole series of unusual events coming together in a very peculiar way. That essentially popular frenzy over the blowing up of the Maine and over the humanitarian crisis in Cuba prompted a kind of popular anxiety about American power that led to this kind of burst of imperialism. But eventually cooler heads prevailed, and that the U.S.'s pattern of pursuing power through non-colonial means very quickly asserted itself. So this was an interpretation that was advanced by the notion that American foreign policy, for the most part, was very rational, was not war-minded, but that there were these exceptions, and that this was one of these unusual exceptions to the rule. This interpretation was challenged beginning in the 1950s and 60s by a new group of historians that were called the revisionists. And they looked and said, look, by 1898, the U.S. is already becoming a world power. It doesn't have colonies, though Britain and France and Germany have colonies, but it has growing economic interests. It has rising industrial output. It's looking for markets very aggressively. It's looking for opportunities to assert its power. So there's nothing new about 1898. In fact, 1898 really represents continuity with what came before. Some people looked for continuity with the conquest of the West. Who looked at, the U.S. has long been projecting military power across the North American continent, subduing Indian societies in order to extend American power and the power of white settlers. There's nothing especially new about that in 1898. Others emphasize the economic dimensions, that the use of military power to extend U.S. economic power was not new in 1898. So that thesis, which was advanced and popularized very much in the Vietnam War era, and with keeping in mind, the controversies over the war in Vietnam, became a powerful and influential interpretation, in the mid to late 20th century. And then finally, I guess I would add one more recent interpretation, which has been advanced really since the 1990s, and that really emphasizes cultural factors, that looks at ideas about race, about gender, about nationalism, and begins to look at them as possible causal forces, that it may be that part of the reason the U.S. gets involved in these new parts of the Spanish colonial world is because of these ideas and beliefs about Americans and about particularly their superiority vis-a-vis Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Filipinos and Spaniards, and that those ideas and beliefs and other cultural factors came to play a decisive role in the making of the events of 1898.
Paul, if I could just interject here, the revisionist historians would maintain that the imperialism of 1898 was an extension, a continuation of manifest destiny. Is that fair to say? Because that was one of our questions in the forum.
Yes, very much. I mean, some of these historians and some of the prominent names are William Appleman Williams and Walter Lefebvre would hold that there are some long continuities in American foreign relations, and that what was called the pursuit of the open door, that is to say, the insistence that areas need to be opened up for American trade, that goes back to manifest destiny in many respects, and that it continues all the way forward into the Cold War. And so they would see, there to be strong continuities linking the manifest destiny of the early 19th century and, Cold War U.S. foreign policy with the events of 1898 being somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. We have an interesting question here from one of our participants. How does the Monroe Doctrine figure into all of this, reaching way back into the 19th century? Does it figure into this at all?
I mean, I think it depends on which school you're looking at. I mean, I think the revisionists would argue that the Monroe Doctrine is an important element that demonstrates a certain amount of continuity between the early and the late 19th century. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine being this incredibly sort of ambitious statement of a kind of preemptive authority the United States has over the Western Hemisphere to the exclusion of European colonial empires. This was not a kind of doctrine the United States initially had the power to really uphold. And it's really only in the late 19th century when there's the military and naval muscle in order to be able to actually assert that kind of power in the Western Hemisphere. But you could argue that the Monroe Doctrine, in a sense, is a rhetorical attempt to clear out hemispheric space for the United States, which it's only in the late 19th century that the U.S. can really only fill with actually existing power.
Mm-hmm. So you might say the Monroe Doctrine was sort of aspirational at the time it was promulgated.
Yes, exactly. And in the turn of the century, we get what comes to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is about the right of U.S. interference and military and diplomatic intervention in the hemisphere in order to secure order. And that really, represents, the kind of the ability to fulfill on this earlier aspiration.
Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Sure. Okay, so let's turn from this document to Emilio Aguinaldo. Just to give you a little background about Aguinaldo. So he is from a landowning elite family in the Philippines. He's very young, talented military commander of the Revolutionary Army in the Philippines in 1896 and 7. He's part of a political revolutionary movement called the Katipunan that is a very broad-based egalitarian movement that seeks to not only overthrow Spanish authority, but to also transform Filipino society to make it more egalitarian, to make it more open to the political power of the working classes and the peasantry. And it has a very strong sort of Catholic millenarian dimension to this movement. But its leadership is fairly elite like Aguinaldo. And while Aguinaldo is not himself highly educated, many of the other figures in the movement are people who have traveled and studied in Europe. They go by the name Ilustrado, which means enlightened. And so they're very much in dialogue with global currents in terms of notions of sovereignty, notions of government. And their aspiration of Aguinaldo's movement is to found a modern republic as they understand it. So this is a document in which Aguinaldo is laying the case before the American people for why the U.S. effort to reconquer the Philippines is misguided. And in fact, this document is authored by one of Aguinaldo's chief lieutenants, and Aguinaldo had a number of very talented legal advisors that supplied many of the kind of speeches and public pronouncements that he would issue in the crisis of U.S. invasion. So should I go ahead and read the document?
Yeah, go ahead and read it, Paul. We'll then discuss it.
Okay. You have been greatly deceived in the personality of my countrymen. You went to the Philippines under the impression that their inhabitants were ignorant savages. The Filipinos have been described in serious American journals as akin to the hordes of the Khalifa, and the idea has prevailed that it requires only some unknown American Kitchener to march triumphantly from north to south to make the military occupation complete. We have been represented by our popular press as if we were Africans or Mohawk Indians. We smile and deplore the want of ethnographical knowledge on the part of our literary friends. Here you had a people who placed themselves at your feet, who welcomed you as their savior, who wished you to govern them and protect them. In combination with the genius of our countrymen and their local knowledge, methods, and priestcraft into an enlightened republic with America as its guide, a happy and contented people, and that in the short space of a few months without the sacrifice of a single life. So a couple of things we see going on in this document that are interesting. One is that Aguinaldo's advisors are clearly tuned into the American press. That even though we're talking about around 1900, we're talking about an era before the globalization of communications of the kind that we have now, but there is a kind of globalization that's already happened. So that Aguinaldo, in the middle of fighting the U.S. force in the Philippines, he and his advisors are aware that what's happening in the Philippines is that in order to justify the U.S. invasion, the defenders of colonialism are representing Filipinos as savages, as people that are not capable of governing themselves, and who therefore have to be governed from the outside by an outside power, just like the British are doing in parts of their empire. And so what's happening is that kind of racialized media is making its way to the Philippines, and Aguinaldo is essentially mocking it. He's saying, look, we are not, like Africans or Mohawk Indians, that here he's trading in some of the same racial imagery the colonialists would have used. He says, we're not like them. We're civilized like the Americans, and therefore we are deserving of self-government the same as the United States. And then he sort of turns and says, here you have a people who place themselves at your feet. So the Filipinos initially welcomed you. They accepted your claims of being a force for liberation. All we wanted was to govern ourselves under your protection. And in a sense, you turned your back on that and are now pursuing a very different path.
Okay, we have a question here. Would Americans have interfered with the Philippines or Cuba had there been no business prospects involved? Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's very hard to say that in the sense that, or determine that, in that, counterfactual history, that is to say speculative history where we change one factor and then try to figure out what would have happened has to remain speculative. My guess is that what would have happened I think there's a number of things that have to come into play for the U.S. to become a colonial power, and I think that the push for markets in Asia were very powerful. On the other hand, I think had there not been revolutions that weakened Spanish authority in both those areas, I don't think the U.S. would have become involved in the same way. I think that the likelihood the U.S. would have become a major commercial influence and power in the Caribbean and in East Asia was going to happen, I think, regardless. But I think that it's a combination of those interests and the crisis of this kind of sudden implosion in Spanish power that makes it possible for the U.S. to get a military foothold. Those are really the forces that come together. So I think the economic power of the United States would have been extended in these areas, but I think in a very different way had there not been an invasion. I think that's especially true in the Philippines.
Paul, let's give our participants a chance to do some close reading here. I think if they were going to use this passage with students, I think one way to get students deeply involved would be to pose the second part of our first discussion question there. In what ways can the document itself be seen as an effort to counter stereotypical images that the American media have been producing regarding the Philippine people? Why don't we throw that one out on the table and have our participants respond to that, because I think that would be a really good question, a really good way to get students involved in a close reading of this document. So why don't we try that? What are your comments? How does this document counter the American stereotypical image of the Filipinos at this time? Anyone? Any takers on that? Well-spoken and intelligent. What else? We're going to be asking our students, to give exact words, to cite the text. Any citations here that we might want to particularly point to? While we're waiting for that, Paul, who was Kitchener? Why don't you refresh our memories there?
Kitchener is a British general known for his campaigns in Africa in exactly this moment. And so here, Aguinaldo and his advisors who are writing this document are making fun a little bit of the fact that the United States is behind the British, right? It required only some unknown American Kitchener to march triumphantly from north to south, right? So, but invoking this notion of British imperial pomp in order to, in a way, criticize the United States for trying to imitate the British instead of being what Aguinaldo wants to maintain the United States was before, which was a society that pursued self-government for itself and encouraged the self-government of other peoples. Okay,
well, we've gotten some responses. The piece suggests an openness to foreigners, as in other countries. The fact that the Filipinos can and did counter speaks to their intelligence. Talks about giving us a chance, treat us exactly as you demand to be treated at the hands of England. They deplored want of ethnographical knowledge. I think that would be a key word to point out here, that the author of this can deploy technical academic language like that, speaks to several key criticisms of the Filipino people and attempts to debunk at least and address these points. It's a very intelligent piece. The language within the text proves that a competent group of people are actively watching what is happening. Yeah, I think that's true. And you've got these cultural references. You've got the Khalifa, you've got the Mohawks, Africans. It shows these people are aware of what's going on in the world. So I think this would be a good piece to have your students really dig into, to show how the Filipinos tried to counter stereotypical images that were being retailed about them. Paul, anything else about this piece?
Yeah, I just wanted to support the interpretations that I'm seeing on the chat room. That I think that emphasizing the elevation of the language, I think, is really important. That this is very much trying to make the case in the American public. And this was a document that circulated in the American press, particularly, I think, through the auspices of the anti-imperialist movement. And it's very much these highly sort of sophisticated references to ongoing global realities like Kitchener, right, the Khalifa, that is very much trying to make the case for Filipino advancement, but also to do that rhetorically.
Okay, well, shall we move ahead then?
Yeah, all right. So Okay, turning to the next document. So this is called The White Man's Burden. It's from the New York Age, which was an African-American newspaper, edited by T. Thomas Fortune. And it's published in April 1899, which is just 2 months into the Philippine-American War. And the quote is, "Nobody has asked the white races to rob and enslave the black and yellow races of the earth. The burden, if such it be, was assumed voluntarily and without the consent or desire of the victims who preferred and still prefer their land and liberty and freedom from the tyranny of white men. They do not thank them for the assumption of the alleged burden and the alleged sacrifices. From Warren Hastings and Lord Clive in India to Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, the despoiled native has hated his despoiler and groaned under the load of foreign rule and taxation forced upon him." So just to give us context, a couple of points of context for this document. So clearly here the title is an ironic reference to the Rudyard Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden. And what people don't often know about the term white man's burden is that it's actually a term that comes into being in a poem that Kipling writes about the Philippine-American War. Kipling, of course, is the poet laureate of British imperialism, right, who writes works that in complicated ways celebrate the triumphs of British colonialism, particularly in India. But he's also part of Anglo-American networks. He's got a lot of American friends. He's corresponding constantly with Americans, and he's really tuned into what's happening in 1898. And it's in 1899, right as the war with the Philippines is beginning, that he writes the poem The White Man's Burden, which recasts the Philippines, rather recasts colonialism, European colonialism, all kinds, in self-sacrificial terms. That it makes colonialism out to be this sort of benevolent, generous thing that Europeans are doing on behalf of ungrateful natives around the world. And so the poem The White Man's Burden, which has this kind of sing-songy kind of rhythm, ends up sort of celebrating colonialism, but also depicting it as a form of sacrifice rather than of greed and the pursuit of self-interest. And the poem, you know, we would now say it went viral, you know, that it circulates very, very widely throughout the world, both in the British imperial world and beyond. And it gets taken up by proponents, by supporters, and by critics. And within 6 months, there are probably 80 versions of the poem that get written as parodies or as satires that use Kipling's language and his, you know, kind of musical rhythm to turn the white man's burden on its head. And so you have suffragists who make it, you know, the white woman's burden. You have, you know, the labor movement that turns it into the working man's burden, etc. And so this is T. Thomas Fortune, who is an African-American newspaper editor, who is really on the progressive edge of black politics during this period, that he is pushing for African-American civil and political and economic rights further than virtually anybody else at that moment. This is a moment when the fortunes of black people in the United States have really reached their bottommost point in many respects. Jim Crow is beginning to consolidate in the South. Lynching is taking off. The nation as a whole has turned its back on civil rights. The North is really looking towards industrialization. It's not really paying that much attention to black civil rights. And so in that context, Fortune is really, pushing what, we'll recognize later as a really, progressive thread of black politics. And he, of course, is very concerned about the advent of U.S. colonialism because of the way he sees the justifications of colonialism tapping into all of its racial language about the superiority of the white races. And he sees this, quite rightly, as something that's going to be very negative for black people in their pursuit of rights. That if Europeans can justify taking over territories on the other side of the earth on the grounds that those inhabitants are non-white, what chance do African Americans inside the United States have of pursuing civil rights? And so that's really the point of this excerpt is to really undermine the kind of condescending and self-congratulatory language of Kipling by saying, look, it's always clear who the burden of colonialism falls on, and it's not the white man, it's actually colonial subjects, the people that are being denied life, land, and liberty.
Right. Paul, this address that you just addressed one of the questions we had in the forum. Someone asked, to what extent did the term white man's burden resonate with the American public? And you're just saying that it resonated quite strongly with the American public. We have an interesting comment here about the International Baccalaureate. Participant writes, we are supposed to teach students globally. I understand the content and presentation must be age appropriate, but isn't this thought process, a thought process I think that Western nations felt that they could rule others because the others were inferior or savage, isn't that thought process global? Would it be safe to say that thought process was Western and really wouldn't be global? I mean, what Fortune is saying here is that the victims of imperialism who live all over the globe don't embrace that, but the West does. So would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that the ideology of European or white supremacy is both Western and global at this moment. It's Western in that it comes out of kind of greater Europe, right? Both Europe and its American extension in a sense. It's Western in that it's about asserting the power of Western institutions and Western governments over the rest of the world, but it's global in that it also declares, the right of Westerners to rule globally. And in fact, as a result of these kind of ideas, the Western powers will extend their rule throughout the globe until something like 2/3 of the globe is under the supremacy of Europe and the United States. And so I guess I would say that it's both a Western and a global set of ideas.
Mm-hmm. So it originated in the West but had a global impact.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good. Shall we move on then?
Sure. Okay. So this is another of the kind of, attempts to reverse Kipling. This one is, less direct than Fortune, who, basically just says, look, the burden is not the white man's burden, lays it out very forcefully. This is more of a parody, right, that uses Kipling's form, right, in order to make a similar point to the one that Fortune was making. So I'll go ahead and read it. Pile on the black man's burden, 'tis nearest at your door. Why heed long bleeding Cuba or dark Hawaii's shore? Halt ye your fierceless armies, which menace feeble folks, who fight with clubs and arrows and brook your rifle's smoke. Pile on the black man's burden, his wail with laughter drown. You've sealed the red man's problem and now deal with the brown. In vain you seek to end it with bullet, blood, or death. Better by far defend it with honor's holy breath. Pile on the black man's burden, his back is broad though sore. What though the weight oppress him, he's borne the like before. There were Jim Crow laws and customs and fiendish midnight deed, though winked at by the nation, will someday trouble breed. Pile on the black man's burden, at length 'twill heaven pierce. Then on you or your children will rain God's judgment fierce. For battleships and armies may weaker ones appall, but God Almighty's justice they'll not disturb at all. So those of you who know Kipling's poem will recognize the very distinctive rhyme scheme here. And anyone at the moment this was written would have immediately gotten the joke in a sense. And admittedly, it's a very dark joke, right? He's really satirizing this notion of white self-sacrifice in Kipling. He's making a number of arguments. He's making the argument that that people of color, and specifically African Americans, have borne, in a sense, the white man's burden in the form of slavery and now in the form of Jim Crow. He makes the argument that that the U.S. is kind of cowardly for fighting weaker societies that can't put up military force right? The people who, quote, fight with clubs and arrows and broke your rifle's smoke. So the U.S. can take no manly pride in having conquered these territories because they don't represent military equals. Right? He makes the argument for continuity that what the U.S. is doing in the Philippines is similar to what the United States government has done with Native Americans, right? It says here, you've sealed the red man's burden and now deal with the brown. And then finally, it makes this very sort of wary, or rather kind of condemning argument vis-a-vis God, and the notion that that while U.S. force might be able to temporarily defeat these societies that can't yet defend themselves, obviously, you know, in the long run, God will judge the rightness of this, right? God Almighty's justice, your battleships and armies will not disturb, right? So it's ultimately invoking a sense that even if justice is not done in this world, to guarantee, you know, greater freedom as opposed to colonialism, that in the next world, the United States will stand condemned for its actions.
Paul, when was this poem published?
I think this one is also 1899.
Yeah, I think it was too. Yeah, yeah. Any comments or questions about the poem? How do you think this would work with your students? Were you to use it in your classes? Here we go. Will someday trouble breed? Long-term ramifications of colonialism? Yes, both abroad and at home. You think your students would respond to this? It's no wonder that Americans are perceived as being greedy by foreign nations. How do you help students come to terms with this reality and with your knowledge of American imperialism and what we are evolving into today? Interesting point. Okay. Here's somebody noting here, my students would go into, would dig into the statements in this one. Good teaching tool. Okay. Paul, shall we move ahead then?
Sure. Okay, so this one is an essay called The White Man's Duty. It's from an American missionary magazine in the early 20th century. And just to give some context here, the late 19th century is an era when, you know, the U.S. industrial capacity is developing and expanding, and as U.S. commerce is beginning to extend beyond U.S. borders, it's also a period where the mission movement begins to really rise in the United States. So the numbers of missionaries and also the number of different societies and cultures that they're working in begins to widen in the late 19th century. And East Asia becomes particularly important as a site of missionization. This is a period when you begin to get overlaps between Protestant evangelicalism and American nationalism. And so as the U.S. becomes more economically powerful, and after 1898 more militarily powerful, that resonates for missionaries with the sense that the United States is a Christian society and that it's using its governmental power to not only extend commerce, not only to extend governmental authority, but also to clear the way open for Protestantism. And so missionaries are very excited about, by and large, by the beginnings of U.S. colonialism after 1898, because they're convinced that once the U.S. has a military and ultimately a civilian colonial government in these places, it's going to pave the way for missionaries who, up until this point, have in many cases been blocked or partially blocked from exercising their influence. And so you see, missionaries, propagandizing on behalf of the U.S. war effort in many instances, precisely because they link American nationalism and American Protestantism in this way. Now, it's important to kind of realize that there are also critics. There are some Protestant critics that are very wary about particularly the character of the U.S. war in the Philippines, which ends up involving extensive American atrocities. Some clergymen become very concerned with the moral character of the war and the impact this is going to have on American morality. They're very concerned with the fact that there's a lot of drinking and a lot of prostitution in the Philippines among American soldiers. So they begin to think that colonialism might not be such a good thing for American virtue and morality. But that said, I think the bulk of American Protestant missionaries, in part because of this missionary contact, have become quite supportive of this extension of U.S. power. So this is the excerpt. Quote, "The white man has a burden to bear. There are and always have been in the ethnological classifications dominant and subordinate races. Not the most fertile nor the most comfortably situated places have led to the civilizations of the world. It was not the appointment of providence or nature, but the character of the peoples themselves which has kept them a prey of other peoples and races. If crimes similar to those that are committed in the South were committed by the Indians of the prairie, it would be deemed sufficient for the wiping out of the whole tribe. But how much greater is the disgrace, the shame, the crime when these outrages are committed by the white race, who should be the dominant factor in civilization?" So we see a couple of things going on here that are going on that are interesting in this document. One is that it clearly puts itself in the camp of scientific racism of the period, that where one of the forces in the 19th century that had really put certain kind of brakes on, highly scientific notion of separate races or even separate species of humanity. One of the main religious arguments had been, no, the Bible clearly says that there is one humanity, that we are, all equal children of God, and therefore we need to fight these doctrines of scientific racism. Clearly, this document has picked sides in that battle and has chosen the racist side by essentially saying there is not one humanity, or there are multiple humanities, whether there's one humanity, but there are these distinct races, some of whom are superior and some who are inferior. And the superior ones have a right to govern over the inferior ones. That said, it then turns and makes an argument against lynching. It says here, if the atrocities committed in the South, and here it's referring to lynching, were committed by Indians of the prairie, it would be deemed sufficient for the wiping out of the whole tribe. But nonetheless, it says, in effect, the nation lets white Southerners off the hook for these kinds of atrocities because they're committed by the white race. This is a very complicated document because, on the one hand, it's committed to criticizing lynching, which by the turn of the century has become an epidemic throughout much of the South. On the other hand, it clearly opposes lynching because of a sense of racial superiority, right? That white people are supposed to know better than to do these kind of atrocities, right? These are the kind of atrocities that we associate with Indians, that we associate with savage people, right? As a civilized people, we should be above this kind of violence, which is really conducted by our racial inferiors, right? So this is what's complicated here. This is an anti-lynching document that's also a racist document.
So, Paul, this document also speaks, I think, to one of the questions in the form: what role did social Darwinism play in our foreign policies? You're talking here about dominant and subordinate races. Could you comment on the extent to which social Darwinism plays into this? And then we also have another question raised in the chat right now, but it also refers to a question in the form. What role does religion, Christianity, play in all of this? Could you respond to those points?
Sure. On social Darwinism, I guess I would say first, the last generation of historians have actually challenged the notion that there was such a thing as social Darwinism in the narrow sense of a doctrine that applies Darwin's theory to human society. And I'm pretty persuaded by that. I mean, I think that that what we can talk about in the late 19th century, though, in place of social Darwinism, I think, is what we could call scientific racism. And that is that, there are all kinds of racial ideologies floating around in the 19th century. And in part, as science begins to develop in the United States, and as the university system begins to develop, it's not surprising that you would get versions of racism that crossed an understanding of science and an attempt to create a hierarchy of races. And so what we get are these ideologies like the ones in this text that say, look, in nature there are these different races, we can identify and classify and measure the different features, but in a sense the world order in which Westerners dominate non-Westerners is one that is rooted in the character of human beings themselves rather than in in this case, this document, either divine providence or in the willed actions of men and society. So this is essentially like more powerful animals conquering less powerful animals. So, so I think in that sense, if social Darwinism isn't necessarily a factor, because I think it may not, in fact, exist as an entity, but this kind of scientific racism clearly is very powerful. And here what's interesting is that we have missionaries using it, right? So this is not a document by scientists. This says something about the authority of this kind of scientific racism, that it's being used here even in the hands of people that are not themselves committed to science as a profession.
Paul, could you define scientific racism for us, please?
I would say that scientific racism is our efforts to apply scientific notions of the natural world and the investigation of the features and rules and laws of the natural world to the effort to rank groups of people understood to be races.
So it's an attempt to establish racial hierarchies on scientific grounds, on empirical grounds.
Yeah, exactly. And to then try to understand the relationship between those races in terms of scientific laws. And so one of the reasons people use the term social Darwinism is because one element of this scientific racism was this notion that races clash with each other, that it is it is part of what happens in nature, is that superior and inferior races clash with each other all the time as a function of nature, the same way different species would fight in the jungle, and that it is inevitable that the stronger races will come to dominate.
We have a question here of interpretation here. Person Ashley Gill writes, it almost seems as though the document is saying if anyone other than whites were doing this, it would be frowned upon. Almost to the sense that it's okay if whites are doing it because they are the dominant race and know what is best in the end. Is that quite what's going on here? Isn't this document saying, in effect, that lynching in the South is sort of below the dominant race? This is something we shouldn't be doing, something we might expect from lower orders, but it is really not something we would expect from the dominant race.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's partly what makes it both an anti-lynching document and a document that favors racial hierarchy, right? Is the sense is that, the white race is better than this, that one of the features of these inferior races that we're busy conquering is that they practice this brutal and extreme form of violence amongst each other and against us. But if we want to continue to dominate the world, we have to play by different rules. We have to play by more respectable, more civilized rules. And so this is a complicated document because it both criticizes, the most brutal form of racial violence, but also does it in the name of preserving white hierarchy.
We have a question here about scientific racism and eugenics. Eugenics was based on scientific racism. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say that eugenics represents a variant of scientific racism that really is invented in the early 20th century. So we can talk about scientific racism beginning in the 1880s, 1890s. Eugenics comes in around 1900. And what eugenics represents is what happens when scientific racism crosses with the new science of genetics. In the 19th century, there's not really a genetic science. And in the early 20th century, you begin to get, much more concerted study of heredity, of what it is that, allows features and traits to be passed from one generation to the other. And what happens is that scientific racists begin to look into heredity as a way of thinking about intervening in the process of racial reproduction. And eugenics is really, in a sense, it's the interventionist side of scientific racism. It's saying, what would happen if we took what we knew about scientific racism and implemented it? We passed laws that said that people that are feeble-minded or racially inferior or crippled or handicapped or otherwise undesirable, if we sterilize them, so we prevent them from passing along their traits to the next generation. So it's in a sense racial science or scientific racism, implemented in order to try to actually achieve a kind of racial engineering in society.
Okay, well, we've got about 30 minutes to go, Paul. Shall we move ahead?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, the March of the Flag by Albert Beveridge. So this is a famous speech given by Albert Beveridge, who's a young senator from Indiana, the Republican Party. He's kind of a rising star in Republican circles in 1898. And he gives the speech in the Senate, which lays out one of the most kind of triumphalist, kind of rhetorically bombastic accounts of why the U.S. campaign in the Philippines and the broader project of imperialism are justified. And Beveridge will continue to be an important standard bearer for American colonialism in the early 20th century, particularly as the war becomes more controversial, as the anti-imperialists continue their lobbying efforts, as word of atrocities begins to circulate back to the United States. Beveridge and others, particularly in the Republican Party that's in power at that time, will give speeches like this in order to lay out before the American people why the U.S. is justified in doing what it's doing. So it's important to see speeches like this in the context of a very lively debate in the United States about what the U.S. is doing, especially in the Philippines, and whether this is good for Filipinos, and especially whether it's good for the United States. So this is an excerpt from the March of the Flag. It is a mighty people that he, God, has planted on this soil, a people sprung from the most masterful blood of history, a people perpetually revitalized by the virile, man-producing womanfolk of all the earth, a people imperial by virtue of their power, by right of their institutions, by authority of their heaven-directed purposes, the propagandists and not the misers of liberty. The opposition tells us that we ought not govern a people without their consent. I answer the rule of liberty that all just governments derive its authority from the consent of the governed applies only to those who are capable of self-government. We govern the Indians without their consent. We govern our territories without their consent. We govern our children without their consent. It means opportunity for all the glorious young manhood of the Republic, the most virile, ambitious, impatient, militant manhood the world has ever seen. It means that the resources and the commerce of these immensely rich dominions will be increased as much by American energy as greater than Spanish sloth, for Americans henceforth monopolize those resources and that commerce. So this is very rich. This is a very dense text. There's a lot going on here, but part of what I think makes it useful for teaching is that it just packs into a very short text almost all of the justifications that are used in this debate for why the seemingly unprecedented project of taking over a colony on the other side of the earth is in fact something that is not only justified but destined. And we see Beveridge weaving together very different kinds of authority, right? He makes a strong racial argument, right, of the kind that Aguinaldo would be critical of, or T. Thomas Fortune, right, that Americans are the most masterful blood of history, right? Elsewhere, Beveridge will link the United States to the British Empire. We'll say, look, we are both Anglo-Saxons. The British are the most powerful empire on earth. And if we are their offspring, racially speaking, then we also deserve to be a part of this broader imperial project. He uses arguments about masculinity, right? He says twice here that the United States represents a virile society. He praises the man-producing women folk of all the earth, right? He praises women for producing manly men. He makes the racial argument that Aguinaldo had been critical of by saying, the rule of self-government, right, that all people should be able to determine their own fortunes, which might seem to come out of Declaration of Independence and other founding documents of the United States, doesn't pertain to certain groups of people. We've already decided that, right, that it doesn't apply to Native Americans, it doesn't apply to U.S. territories that haven't been fully incorporated into the Union. And then he infantilizes the subjects of the colonies, right? He says we govern our children without their consent. So he analogizes the Filipinos and Puerto Ricans and Cubans to children who have not yet reached their majority. And then finally, he talks about the advantages for the United States, right? So if he said, look, this is partly about who we are, right? That we're manly, we're racially superior. It's partly about who, quote, they are, right? The colonial subject, that they are not worthy of self-government. Finally, he makes an argument based on advantage, right? That ultimately this is going to be about these immensely rich dominions that are going to become more rich because the United States is an active and energetic society, and ultimately this is going to benefit the United States, right? He says outright, we are going to monopolize the resources and the commerce with these new territories, right? So ultimately there's a self-interest argument that he makes here as well.
Well, we have an interesting comment here that sheds, I think, some deeper historical light on Beveridge's speech. This seems to trace its origins back to the Puritans and their arguments for the massacre at Mystic and the providence of God in eradicating the American Indian. Does this have Puritan origins?
Yes and no. I mean, I think some elements of this clearly go back very far. So the American exceptionalism, right, that we see in both the Puritans and in Beveridge, it's a common thread. I mean, the difference is the Puritans are thinking, in a sense, about Puritan exceptionalism, right? They're not yet, imagining an independent nation necessarily, but they are making religious arguments about, the superiority of Puritan civilization and its justification the justification for violence against Native Americans being rooted in that case, divine sanction and superior civilization. And by the late 19th century, Beveridge is adding to that sense of exceptionalism some new elements. It's more nationalist, right? Because he's defending not a small religious enclave, but a powerful nation state. It's mixed up with other justifications like economic power and wealth. So there are some elements and strands that clearly go back to the Puritans, but there's some that are also new that are kind of picking up new dimensions in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Okay. Any comments from our participants on this text? I think this one, as Paul suggested, would make a really good text for you to use in your classes. There's a lot here, a lot of things to focus close reading on. Any other comments before we move ahead? Okay, Paul, why don't we go on to the next text?
Okay. Okay, so this is a text of a speech. Actually, I can't remember if it's originally from a speech or whether it's an essay or a speech that becomes an essay, as many of the anti-imperialists would publish their lectures. It's by William Jennings Bryan, who very important Democratic Party politician in the early 20th century from Nebraska. He's known as a kind of prairie populist for his eloquent, kind of grandiose speaking style and his emphasis on ordinary people, especially farmers and workers. He becomes a leading anti-imperialist figure for a brief moment in the early 20th century when he is running for president in the campaign against William McKinley in 1900. And so he gives a number of addresses and publishes essays opposing U.S. colonization in the Philippines, very much trying to channel the discontents with colonialism that Bryan's constituency are concerned about. But this document reflects some of the broader world of anti-imperialist thinking that Bryan was participating in. Bryan himself, is not necessarily the most committed or consistent anti-imperialist. That he is kind of not a kind of movement person the way some other activists were, but nonetheless, this speech I think indicates some of the main lines of anti-imperialist argument. So I think it's worth looking at for that reason. And here's the excerpt. While the American people are endeavoring to extend an unsolicited sovereignty over remote peoples, foreign financiers will be able to complete the conquest of our own country. Labor's protest against the blacklist and government by injunction and its plea for arbitration, shorter hours, and a fair share of the wealth which it creates will be drowned in noisy disputes over new boundary lines and the clashing of conflicting authority. It is not strange that the laboring men should look with this undisguised alarm upon the prospect of Oriental competition upon the farms and in the factories of the United States. Our people have legislated against Chinese immigration, but to exclude a few Chinese and admit many Filipinos is like straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. So like the Bryan, this is a document that in a very short text actually gets a lot of the main concerns of the anti-imperialists in one document. And we can see here that that Bryan is mostly concerned with domestic issues, right? This is not really a document about what foreign conquest is going to mean for Filipinos or Cubans or Puerto Ricans. It's very much an argument about what does this mean for us, and specifically what does it mean for working people in the United States. And here he argues that at a very moment at the turn of the century when you have a labor movement that's beginning to strike, that's beginning to become more active and to organize, you have a populist movement of farmers that are trying to hem in the power of banks and railroads in order to get a fair shake for farmers, that basically imperialism is going to distract these social movements. It's going to detract their attention. It's going to distract the attention of policymakers so that they're not as concerned with reforming American capitalism as the way that they need to. And so he says here, labor's protests will go down drowned in noisy disputes over new boundary lines, right? So that suddenly the attention that's being paid to workers and farmers' discontents is just going to end up being crowded out of the headlines with news of foreign battles and disputes with foreign powers. So that's the one argument, is a kind of distraction argument, right? We only have so much political attention span in this country, and war is going to take our attention away from crucial issues that the working people of the United States demand attention to. And then the second argument is a racist argument, and it's an argument that's directed against Asian immigration. And the argument is, look, if the United States becomes involved in, sending its troops abroad and then setting up a government in the Philippines, it's going to create networks of immigrants from Asia who are going to come to the United States at a very moment when the United States has passed very draconian laws to try to prevent Chinese immigration. And so here Brian is tapping into not only working class reform ideas about, let's not distract attention from the 8-hour day movement. He's also tapping into working class racism against Asians, and the sense that, we've successfully barred the Chinese, but if we take the Philippines, aren't we going to open the floodgates to Filipino immigration?
Well, we have a question here about Brian. Did he maintain his anti-imperialistic policies when he served as Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State?
I mean, not so much. I mean, I guess it depends on how you define imperialism. But by the time Brian is Secretary of State under Wilson, he's very consistent with Wilsonian foreign policy. And Wilson himself is not a supporter, by the time he's president, is not a supporter of, taking, lots of permanent colonies. He runs in 1912 on a platform that's committed to giving eventual independence to the Philippines. Eventual comes to mean, decades of time. So he's not in favor of radically adjusting U.S. colonialism. Under Wilson, the United States will take additional colonies and occupations. It will occupy Haiti, it will occupy Nicaragua, it'll send an expeditionary force to Mexico. So Wilson is actually not, when it comes to the Western Hemisphere, the anti-imperialist that he is often depicted to be. And Brian becomes associated with that foreign policy. So, no, I think Brian, in many ways, his biggest moment of anti-imperialism is in many respects at the turn of the century.
Okay. And we have this text raises a question that was brought up in the forum. How did average Americans feel about our involvement abroad, especially given the nation's long history of avoiding foreign entanglements?
I mean, it's very hard to assess authoritatively, given the sources we have, how average Americans felt about the taking of colonies in the Caribbean and the Philippines. I mean, what we do have are studies of editorial opinion in a number of newspapers, so we have pretty good regional breakdown. So we know something about what editors thought. We have a lot of publications, which again tend to come from more urban, more literate, more educated people. So they give us a little bit of a class sort of segment of information. I mean, I think it's safe to say that Americans were very divided about colonialism. For the reasons that that the debate illustrates. That on the one hand, there was a sense that the U.S. as a rising power had a right to take these colonies, that it may need them in order to compete internationally, in order to secure markets at a time when the rest of the world was rapidly being carved up. There was a sense of not wanting to be left out, not wanting to be left the only powerful industrial society that didn't have these military footholds overseas. On the other hand, there's a lot of concern about what waging a war like the kind in the Philippines, particularly, which goes on for 3 years throughout much of the archipelago, but as long as 10 years in other parts of the archipelago. So there's a sense there's a war that is protracted. There's constant news about violence in the Philippines, soldiers being killed, and of atrocities being committed, both by Filipinos and by Americans. And there's a sense that concern that the freedom of American institutions may not be able to survive too many of these kinds of military interventions. And there's some strata of American opinion that's very concerned about Filipinos and other groups that are losing their sovereignty over themselves. That actually is not the main issue in the debate, I think, for Americans at the turn of the century. They're much more concerned about the implications of projecting this kind of military force in the long term for taxing the American people. It's going to require the building up of a big government, a big military apparatus, and that's going to be costly. It's going to take away from other priorities. So I think the American people are very divided around these kinds of issues at the turn of the century.
So that echoes arguments we're having today. How did it break down, or did it break down along party lines? Were the Democrats anti-imperialistic and the Republicans imperialistic, or vice versa? How did it break down along party lines?
Yeah, it does for the most part break down on party lines, not without exceptions. So the Democratic Party ends up, being, more committed to anti-imperialism, and that's for a complex of reasons. It has something to do with the particular groups that are in the Democratic Party at the turn of the century. It has a lot of Southern sort of white Democrats, essentially the party of the Confederacy, that has a lot of sensitivity to foreign occupations. Given the legacies of the Civil War, it's very concerned about the racial implications of getting involved with non-white people through colonialism. You have in the Democratic Party some labor groups that are concerned about the way that this is going to be bad for workers. It's going to lead to greater taxation of workers. It's going to be American workers that ultimately have to sacrifice their lives in the trenches in fields of the Philippines. You also have some kind of liberals in the Democratic Party that are more concerned with issues of equal rights, issues of a Filipino self-government. The Republican Party ends up becoming the party of intervention and empire under McKinley. It's the party of big business that's very concerned about these overseas markets. And it becomes a partisan issue, really in the 1900 election, the presidential election. It becomes a major issue between the parties. So Bryan, who up to that point has not really made imperialism a major emphasis, chooses to make imperialism what he calls the paramount issue in 1900. McKinley is reelected in the 1900s, but there are a number of other issues that are arguably more important to the American people, especially in terms of the domestic economy. And so historians have tried to argue that, or they've debated whether the fact that McKinley gets strongly reelected in 1900, was that the American people voting on imperialism and voting favorably? And the consensus is that they weren't, that in fact there were other kinds of issues that were more important in the debate.
Okay, well, I want to be sure we get to our cartoons. We've got about 11 minutes left to go. Shall we move ahead then?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's. This is addressed by Ben Tillman, a senator from South Carolina in the U.S. Senate. Ben Tillman is one of the most notorious violent white supremacists in the South at the turn of the century. He's somebody who comes up through participating in white supremacist mobs involved in vigilante violence against African Americans. And he really makes white supremacy, in many respects, the core of his political career. He also becomes an anti-imperialist at the turn of the century for reasons that will be made clear in this document. So here's the quote. "I wish to call attention to a fact which may have escaped the attention of senators thus far. With 5 exceptions, every man in this chamber who has to do with the colored race in this country voted against the ratification of the treaty. It was not because we are Democrats, but because we understand and realize what it is to have 2 races side by side that cannot mix or mingle without deterioration and injury to both and the ultimate destruction of the civilization of the higher. Why not tell these people, the Filipinos, now before further blood is shed? We brought you from Spain and have title. We only want enough of your territory to give us a harbor of refuge, a naval station, the right to protect you from outside interlopers, and to get such commercial advantages as you of right ought to give us. Pass a resolution of that kind, and then if those people will not listen to reason and continue to fire on the flag, I, for one, will say the blood will be on their own heads. Let slip the dogs of war and teach them to respect the stars and stripes. So what's happening here is that he's saying, look, Southerners have voted against the Treaty of Annexation for the Philippines, and we've done it essentially on racial grounds. And we realize that, you know, mingling white and non-white peoples is dangerous. It's costly to white people, and better to just, in a sense, keep them at arm's length when we have a choice. And that's essentially a kind of there's a racial aversion argument here that is also anti-imperialist. And what he's arguing here is for a kind of minimalist empire. You could say, he's saying, look, we don't want the whole territory, we don't want to run the place. What we want is commercial advantages, a harbor, a naval base. What he's arguing for is very much what the United States will end up having in Cuba for the next 50 years. Is a kind of a footprint-based empire, you could say, where you don't run the colony, you don't fly your flag over it, you have access through military bases and through commercial treaties, but other than that, you let people govern themselves.
Okay, any comments or questions about this document? Kind of an interesting argument, anti-imperialistic argument, a racist argument, basically saying that races don't mix, therefore we shouldn't try to mix them. Any comments or questions? So here we go. We bought you from Spain and have title. I guess somebody didn't get the memo about the 13th Amendment, or maybe they can't deal with it. Bitter party of one. Okay. So, Paul, shall we move ahead to the cartoons? I think they're coming up next.
Okay, sure. Okay, so this is the first of a series of cartoons that I picked out, which I think illustrate some of the debate between, you know, the advocates of colonialism and the anti-imperialist movement at the turn of the century, and which also do a nice job of illustrating in ways that I think are very useful to teach with, the ways that the ideas of race and gender, you know, factored in this debate and helped Americans make sense of what this debate was all about. So these are color reproductions from a wonderful book called The Forbidden Book that was published about 5 years ago, that basically reproduces in color these cartoons from turn-of-the-century newspapers and magazines. So this is the first of the cartoons. It's called "A Trifle Embarrassed," and here's the quote from Uncle Sam: "Gosh, I wish they wouldn't come quite so many in a bunch, but if I've got to take them, I guess I can do as well by them as I've done by the others." So very quickly, what's happening here is an image of a kind of orphan asylum, right, where these strong hands, and here you can see they're labeled "Manifest Destiny," right, are handing this bushel, sort of basket of squalling brown children who are labeled with the names of Spain's former colonies, Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico, are being handed to Uncle Sam, who seems to be running this asylum for orphans. And you can see inside, you know, playing a kind of happy, you know, right around the rosy game are the territories the United States has annexed previously and which have now been tamed, right? They're already inside the asylum. They're happily reformed. They're also lighter skinned, importantly. And then we have this female figure of Colombia, who traditionally represents freedom in American iconography. You can see she's wearing the cape with, you know, part of the flag. She's wearing a red hat that in traditional classical iconography represented a slave who had received their freedom. So she represents freedom. And she clearly looks a little alarmed and a little bewildered at being handed this squalling group of kids and not quite sure what she's going to do with them. And Uncle Sam is sort of reluctantly saying he's gonna bring them in. He thinks he can straighten them out, right? But he kind of wishes they didn't come in quite as rapidly, right? It's going to be hard to process this new bunch.
Well, who are the kids in the garden there? It looks like there's Mexico, Texas, and then maybe a Native American, and who would the white blonde child be?
You know, I'm not. The image is not clear to me from here. The reproduction I'm getting on my screen here doesn't. The resolution doesn't allow me to say. But I think that's supposed to represent the Western territories. I think it's supposed to represent, you know, the areas of North America that have been annexed and fully incorporated into the United States. And so my guess is that that white child represents one of those states.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, shall we move ahead then?
Yeah. Okay. So this image is captioned, "The flag that Dewey hoists on Manila shall never come down." And this is from August 20th, 1898. And that period is very important because, of course, this is before the U.S. is actually a force that's fighting Filipinos in the Philippines. This is just after the Spanish Navy has been defeated. You can see the wreck of the Spanish Navy in the background. It's still the moment when the United States is formally declaring itself to be the liberators of the Philippines from Spanish cruelty. It's the moment when U.S. forces have occupied Manila and hoisted the U.S. flag there, and also successfully occupied Cuba and Puerto Rico. So you could say it's the moment when, you know, American imperialism is at its most optimistic, its most triumphant. It's before the questions about suppressing, you know, the freedom of former Spanish colonial subjects has really occurred to the American people. Something that's already on the minds of many Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos. But in August 1898, there's not yet the kind of ambivalence there will be, you know, by even a few months later. So this cartoon reflects that. We see here McKinley, who represents himself as he's represented as a kind of military figure, right? He's cast as a kind of general. His sword is lower, meaning that, you know, the war is ended. He's not in a fighting position, and he's standing between these two female figures. On the right-hand side, we see Columbia, right, the figure of American freedom, and here she is, you know, shepherding three, again, brown children, Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines, you know, bringing them towards, you know, freedom. We can see that they look a little recalcitrant, especially, you know, Cuba, who still looks a little feisty. Not quite sure whether, you know, he wants to be protected. On the left-hand side, we see an image of the Philippines, and this is an image that's, you know, she's dark-skinned, she's a female figure. She's holding out a petition for American protection. We can see that she's kind of figured as somebody who is, you know, crippled, who's been wounded, presumably by war or by Spanish violence or oppression, and is calling upon McKinley for protection and for aid. That image on the left is one that we really see coming directly out of the imagery from 1895 through 1897, where the American people are becoming more and more concerned about what's happening in Cuba, and the image of the suffering female Cuba as a kind of war-torn refugee becomes very popular in the American media. And here we see it transferred over to the Philippines, in the sense that Filipinos also represent a kind of passive, suffering, pathetic image in need of rescue, in need of protection. And this despite the fact that, you know, 2 months earlier, Aguinaldo declares that he is in charge of the Philippines. There is an independent government under Aguinaldo's authority that is declaring its own right to control the Philippines. So this image runs directly in the face of the ongoing realities in the Philippines, which is not one of pathos and dependence, but one of assertion and of a declaration of self-government. I think in some ways the most interesting thing about this image is McKinley's gesture, which is simultaneously one that offers a kind of protection, but which also seems to be wanting to hold the figure on the left in position. It's a you know, and the look on his eyes is one of paternal protection, but also of condescension.
We have one participant who noted that this looks like a Columbus landing picture, and it does.
Yeah, I think that's a very good observation, because you see, you know, McKinley on the shore, right, in the middle of this tropical abundance, that it's almost as if he's discovered this tropical territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, shall we move ahead?
Sure. Okay, this is a very interesting image from 1900, and the caption is, "If they'll only be good." And the quote from Uncle Sam here is, "You have seen what my sons can do in battle, now see what my daughters can do in peace." So this is a cartoon that comes out really at the the middle of the Philippine-American War. So U.S. troops are moving out from Manila. They're defeating Filipino revolutionaries initially in the areas around Manila, and then in the surrounding countryside. They're fighting. After November 1899, Filipinos adopted guerrilla war strategy. They're forcing the American forces to fight in jungles, to fight a concealed enemy. Filipinos disguise themselves as civilians. They proceed, fighting through a strategy of ambush. The U.S. forces are bogged down in a war they think has ended, only to find that people that have allied themselves with the Americans start shooting at them. So it's a very bewildering war the U.S. forces are fighting. Increasingly there are these little occupied parts of the archipelago where U.S. forces tentatively hold control and power. And in those areas, by 1900, the U.S. government tries to institutionalize different forms of civilian government, where they begin to transition away from military rule towards civilian authority, where there'll be American governmental presence, running everyday government, supported by the U.S. military forces, but able to turn over power to non-military forces and to some members of the Filipino elite that who has control. As part of that civilian effort, the U.S. government begins to bring in teachers, and many of those teachers are former U.S. soldiers. They're not trained in education; they're not necessarily very effective. But they also try to bring in, by 1900, actual American educators, people with experience training, students in the United States. The first wave of these teachers is called the Thomasites. They become nicknamed the Thomasites. They come over on the U.S. ship the Thomas, and the term Thomasites links them to the history of missionary efforts because it makes them sound like they're part of a missionary order. And even though they are participating in an ostensibly secular form of education. And so this is a cartoon that in a sense says, has Uncle Sam saying, look, you've seen the violent and forceful face of American power in the form of our soldiers. Now I'm going to give you an opportunity to work with the more feminine parts of American power in the form of education and sort of tutelage in American values and institutions. And we can see this is symbolized in the transition from male power to female power. Although in practice, many of the Thomasites were in fact men. But here, for the purpose of this cartoon, they're symbolized as being women. And women of a certain kind. These are represented as middle-class women, as genteel women. They're not necessarily fully respectable. That some of the women characters are a little bit satirized in the iconography here. And we see, importantly, that the images of the natives, in this case the Filipinos, are seen to be receptive. They're seen to be curious. They're not hostile. They're sort of cautiously open to the notion of this new form of sort of female educative power. And importantly, Uncle Sam here is offering a caution, right? If they'll only be good, right? So this is very much the kind of warning that a kind of paternalistic adult gives to his or her children, right? It's a good cop, kind of bad cop formula where, we will give you this benevolent, feminine kind of power, but we can always bring back the harsh, masculine form of power if you don't behave. And so that's, in a sense, the kind of parental and paternalist assumption behind this very gendered image.
Okay, Paul, we're going to have to wrap things up. We're going to have to move quickly through the final 3 slides, so why don't we move ahead?
Okay. So very quickly, this is an image that is about satirizing the anti-imperialist movement, about making fun of the opponents of U.S. colonialism and using images of gender to do that. So the icon is called the idol of the aunties. The aunties, A-U-N-T-I-E-S, was a term of derision and ridicule that was used by the defenders of American colonialism to make fun of the critics of the war. And to make them out to be less than men. It's essentially saying, look, if you're not willing to fight for American power, American commerce by taking these colonies, it means that you are really effeminate. You don't have the right stuff to be legitimate men. And so this is a cartoon that put that on display. It addresses some of the prominent anti-imperialist critics in women's clothing. It has them doing things like playing the harp, right, issuing proclamations, and most importantly, worshiping at the image of Aguinaldo. And this is a very sort of racist and gendered image of Aguinaldo. It makes him out to be a kind of dandy, a kind of fop, right, who has this exaggerated military uniform. And his gender is also, his gesture is also meant to convey his own effeminacy. And in the iconography of the time, that he may be gay. This is really a kind of anti-gay image directed at Aguinaldo that makes him out into the illegitimate idol of the affection of these effeminate anti-imperialists.
What is the flag he's on? What does that say? Is it OVV? What's going on there?
Yeah, I don't know actually why that's there. I think that's meant to be some version of the Filipino revolutionary flag. But I'm not really sure where the cartoonist is getting that image because it doesn't really resemble the Filipino revolutionary flag that was used at that time.
Okay. Shall we move ahead?
Yeah. Okay, this is a cartoon from the magazine Judge, and this is meant to make fun of William Jennings Bryan in his 1900 presidential campaign by basically holding him account for being hypocritical in that the Democratic Party that Bryan is running as the standard bearer of in 1900 is simultaneously the party that is opposing colonialism in the Philippines and the conquest of Filipinos, and which is simultaneously responsible in the South for lynching and Jim Crow. And so this is an image that comes from the position of the defenders of colonialism that essentially just ridicules what seems to be double standard. Where on the left-hand side, we see William Jennings Bryan, the anti-imperialist, right, who is supporting in a very paternalistic way the freedom and rights of Filipinos, right? And we see this kind of somewhat infantilized image of Filipinos that he's hugging in a very paternalistic way. And then on the right-hand side, we see this image of, William Jennings Bryan throttling an African American in a way that is meant to resonate with the notion of Jim Crow and lynching. And so this is tapping into a kind of Jekyll and Hyde idea of William Jennings Bryan, and importantly, Jekyll and Hyde, the story, is coming out at exactly this moment. So I think this is something that this cartoonist is definitely trying to cite in saying, in a sense, Bryan is a hypocrite. He's a kind of Jekyll Hyde character when it comes to brown people abroad. He wants to support them and hug them and treat them with affection. And when it comes to, quote, our own people of color, he's willing to tolerate and encourage the worst kind of violence. So in a way, this is tapping into some of that same language that American missionary editorial we talked about a few minutes ago. Is tapping into the same sense of contradiction.
All right, shall we wrap things up with our final one?
Sure. Okay, this is an image that I think really brings it all together in many respects in terms of the defense of American colonialism in its various forms and the use of race and racial imagery to do that, as well as images of maturity and childhood. It's an image of a schoolroom. The caption is "School Begins," and here the quote from Uncle Sam, the school teacher, addressing his new class in civilization, and the quote is, "Now children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while you will feel glad to be here as they are." And so we see there are multiple rows and kind of corners of this classroom that are meant to represent different stages of American sovereignty, and they're also meant to represent different stages of racial development. We can see in the front row the new colonies, and they're very much sort of symbolized in the same way that the orphans were in the first picture. They're brown, they're small. In this case, they look wary. They're, looking a little leery about being in the schoolroom. They're you know, they're represented as somewhat disorderly physically, right? And they're kind of tossing and turning a little bit. Behind them, we see the orderly colonies. These are a little bit like the orphans that were inside the asylum who are dancing happily. Here they're studying their school books dutifully in an orderly way. We see that they're lighter skinned, right? They're meant to represent a full incorporation into the republic, like the settler colonies of North America. Then in the way back, we see a Native American in the corner who has not been fully admitted into the ranks of the obedient white school children. He is kind of in the dunce's position. He's reading an alphabet book, but unlike the other white children, he is reading upside down. And he's still dressed in Indian garb. He's wearing a blanket, so he has not fully been civilized, unlike the other children. Outside the door, we see the image of a Chinese child who has not been allowed entry into the schoolroom. This is a reference to Chinese exclusion, right? The fact that if the schoolroom is meant to represent the American Republic in some sense, because of Chinese exclusion, the Chinese child has been kept outside the door. He has not been fully admitted into the schoolroom. And then finally, we have up in the window the figure of an African American, and he too has not been fully admitted into the ranks of the school of civilization because he's a servile laborer. He's busy polishing the windows of the schoolroom. He is not allowed to be a student in the first place. And the image that's there is a kind of stereotypical kind of Sambo image from turn of the century racist iconography. So here we see Uncle Sam figured as a very stern kind of teacher, taskmaster, who is in the process of trying to discipline these various groups of children in the interest of their civilization, and is facing different stages in that process.
If you can find a better an image with a better resolution, you can actually read what's on that blackboard, and you'll notice that the textbooks that the children are holding have state names on them. So these represent the Western states that have been brought into the Union. Yeah, one participant writes, "This is a great image for student analysis," and I agree that it really is. Any other comments or questions about this image before we wrap things up? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our discussion. Have we answered all of your questions? Do we have any final comments or questions before we bring our seminar to a close this evening? Anything else? Okay, well, let me thank you, Paul, for a wonderful seminar. This has really been illuminating and interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of our participants for participating tonight and for their intelligent participation. Let me see when our next Osceola seminar is scheduled. It looks like we're up for November 13th, when we'll be doing a seminar on America's role in World War I. Please continue to use the forum, ladies and gentlemen, to share fresh approaches and discussion questions and continue the discussion. If you think of any other questions that you weren't able to ask tonight, send them to us in the forum. We'll send them on to Paul and get back to you with a response. I want you to please remember to submit your evaluations. And again, I say thank you very much for your participation, and we hope you'll be back with us again soon. Thank you, and good evening.